thank you, Brieux. Thank you very much to all the panelists to have accepted this invitation to go a little bit more into details. The idea of the first roundtable was to tackle the issue from an academic perspective, or at least to try to understand what was inside the guidance of the Commission. And this second roundtable is to go a little bit more into details into the 3 projects that are ongoing and the 3 procedures. And it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to gather on the same roundtable the project from Czechia, the project from Poland, and the French project as well. So thank you very much to all of you to have accepted to be on this panel. The only person you don't know yet is Charles Wehmüller, because the other panelists already have had the floor, so I will not present them again. But Charles Wehmüller is the Director of Economics at EDF, and he will share the floor with Laurent Cueny on the French project. Marcin will represent the Polish project, and Fabien, as he mentioned earlier, will represent the Czech project. So the idea is to have some kind of row of questions regarding those 3 projects to better understand some of the specificities of each case. Maybe as a first question, it's interesting to come back on the nature of the CfD, because as we understand from the guidance of the Commission, we know CfD for quite a long time, and as for now, it was CfD based on production. This is the case, for example, for Hinkley Point. This is the case for renewable. And in the guidance, the Commission says you can have CfD, production-based CfD, and you can have CfD-based not independent production-based. And we see that in the 3 decisions, there is a tendency which is quite clear that for nuclear, it should be independent production-based CfD. So maybe my first question would be, do you agree with the Commission that it should impose as a solution and that production-based CfD or fusion CfD, meaning that it can be independent from production on certain price level and based on production when the price exceeds the marginal cost, is maybe not a good combination for CfD. So maybe it could be interesting to start with Poland, because for Poland, if I understand correctly, first it was a kind of fusion CfD in the first decision, but maybe the project has evolved and now it's independent based, independent production based. So we can start with you, Marcin, and then the French decision and Czechia.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe just a brief introduction for those of you who are not aware of the details. So the decision in the Polish case was issued December last year, but it's not publicly available yet. That's why I would unravel a little bit of the mysteries behind the decision, but it will be publicly available anyway. I think there's a bit of misunderstanding because the opening decision for the Polish case is available, and Poland envisaged this so-called very long name, load factor strike price adjustment mechanism, which allowed to project the impact of renewables, of the penetration of renewables of the electricity system, forecast the load factor which should be achieved by the new nuclear power plants, given that they do not operate when there are periods of prices below variable costs of nuclear power plants. Finally, this formula was changed, and right now it's based on the CfD reference volume, which is non-production based, which is, in other words, it's exogenous. This is the assumption. The assumption is based on the maximum or average maximum technical capacity of nuclear power plants. It means that this is what nuclear power plants could sell on the forward market and then produce. So this is the point. That's because it makes sense, but due to electricity market design and especially the regulation, which all of the CfDs for nuclear power plants must comply with, there is this, Yugiam showed it in your slide deck, that there is this requirement to react efficiently to market signals. So that's why, first of all, I think it's legally not possible to implement purely production-based CfDs. And then secondly, that there must be some incentives in terms of, for the nuclear power plants, for the operators to react to short-term market signals, meaning that when the periods, when the prices on the short-term markets are lower their variable costs, then to the extent technically possible, lower the output, and when they're higher, just to maximize the output if it's not sold previously. And the CfD formula in the Polish case, it provides incentives to contract on the forward markets just to reflect this reference CfD volume. But there are also certain possibilities, we call it spot price market arbitrage, just to adjust its level on production based on, just to reflect what's happening on the day-ahead market. But it's definitely non-production based, and there is this element for the remuneration of the assumptions of the possibility to produce, but not necessarily to the production itself, which allows to address this produce and forget problem and other possible problems. The question which remains is whether nuclear power plants are really technically well suited to follow the load in this respect, but this is not a mandatory element of the design of the CfD. This is just a possibility which is constrained by technical considerations and also security of supply reasons.
So it's the same, it's a CfD independent of production. What is your view on those type of contracts, and if it is independent of the production of the plant itself, what is the reference that should be taken into account? Because in the guidance of the Commission, we see that they say we can take a normative plant that could be even something different than the technology at stake, or is it necessary a kind of EPR2 reference, or?
So generally speaking, we are going towards capacity-based CfDs, and we're also studying this for renewables, by the way, for many very good reasons. But it's a simple concept, but then if you go to the formula, it becomes very tricky. The aim of the formula is then to demonstrate that the behavior of your operator is not that much affected by the protection provided by the CfD. And it's, of course, to preserve the capacity, the sensitivity to the price signals of the market, but also for EDF, an operator which already operates 57 reactors, to also check that this incentive is not affecting too much. You spoke a lot about modulation policy, the modulation policy of the 57 plus 6 reactors. So we are checking with EDF all the scenarios which might be the future ones, to check that the behavior is not affected that much by the CfD, and we answer to some formula details to preserve the incentive we would like to implement to the CfD. It's important for the Commission, but it's also for the states as well. For you spoke about forward selling of electricity is also an aim we would like to have, and this is something we are discussing with EDF. But maybe, Charles, you want to go a bit more into details between baseload and form we led to EDF, so that we achieve this objective.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's very interesting and very, let's say, stimulating, also from an academic and technical standpoint, because it has been said in the first roundtable, it's the first time we do design long-term contracts such a way, hybrid markets. So as Laurent, you just said, it's definitely an independent-based CFD also, like Poland. So really the principle is to decouple the payments, the financial payments of the CFD from the actual dispatch decisions from the operator, broadly speaking. So when Guillaume, you were talking this morning about different kinds of modulation, different possible incentives, the idea is also to stay a bit on the principles, to say, okay, there will be a lot of decisions to take on short-term markets, real time, to basically choose which markets, when to actually bid and how. It's not just variable cost, it's usage value, opportunity cost, all that. But in any case, the financial payment from the CFD needs to be decoupled from those decisions. It has to be done basically on the two parameters of CFD, the volume and the reference price. The reference price, Marcin, you already talked about it. As far as the reference volume is considered, you alluded to the overall idea of our CFD proposal to the Commission is to somehow split, let's say, the effective financial transfers of CFD into what we can call some kind of a base load leg and a base load remuneration from what we call a shape value in the opening decision of the Commission, which basically means the residual within a year. And somehow, it's a bit crude, but the idea is that the state is going to hedge EDF through the base load leg. So this is why all the financial transfers of the CFD are indexed on base load and annual average parameters, whether it's on price or volume, whereas EDF stays fully exposed on shape. So whatever spreads you can have within a year on an hour-by-hour basis, basically EDF will stay the residual claimant. Hence, it will be incentivized to dispatch fully. So the short answer is basically the reference output is defined ex ante. Then, as Laurent said, when you enter the nitty-gritty, it's more complicated. But I think a nice feature of our proposal is that you have these 3 steps horizon, meaning that on the very short term, through the shape value, the operator is fully exposed and hence fully incentivized to dispatch, not just on a 50-minute time step, but also the maintenance, all the intertemporal constraints should be duly, let's say, internalized in short-term prices. Hence, the operator should basically react to those complete markets on the short term. So that's really the hourly time scale. Then you have the annual time scale where basically to de-risk the economic value of the CFD is that the state brings a hedge to the operator, hence to the project. And then you have the 5-year horizon you might have seen in the opening decision by the Commission, which is every 5 years, basically there will be this kind of review clause to reopen those kind of ex ante parameters, because we are fully aware that at the end of the day, this instrument is a risk-sharing instrument. So the reference profile, then basically you can think of different types of profiles and volume. The idea is that it's basically risk-sharing between the counterparties, the state and EDF, and this risk-sharing somehow can be indexed and updated every 5 years. So 3 time scales.
Thank you. Fabien, on the Czech case?
So the Czech case is ongoing, so I'm not sure what exactly I can say, but what I think is in the public or quasi-public domain is that it is indeed a non-production dependent CFD. What is also useful is to clarify there has been a previous stated decision, Dukoš 25, in the past for one reactor. Now, the ongoing Czech notification is for a new project that is Dukoš 25 and 6, because Czechia has decided instead of doing one to do two, to put it simply. So that means a new case rather than just looking at the Dukoš 25. What is also new, and I think widely known, is that the state aims to have a greater involvement in this new project, Dukoš 25 and 6, compared to the initial Dukoš 25 project. In terms of CFD, what is important is, again, that it's production independent, but perhaps what is different from some of the other projects is that there's going to be 2 periods and 2 different strike prices, in the sense that there would be a strike price for the first period during the repayment of the state loan. And once the state loan is repaid, until the end of the 40 years CFD, you have a new strike price. And this comes back to the point I was mentioning before. If the CFD is, to some extent, an intertemporal mechanism to allocate when and how you are able to make a return, it is certainly different if you have 2 different strike prices during the CFD period or if you have one, in the sense that when you have 2, you can calibrate the returns to be, for instance, closely matching the cost, including the reimbursement of the loan in the first period, and then to have a lower strike price in the second period when you have reimbursed the loan. So I think this is potentially the interesting component in the Czech case, which raises interesting question on what to pay when, essentially, as I said before. Can I just maybe mention another case, which I think is relevant to the question of modulation, your question of nuclear plants? The Belgium one, since we are in Belgium. It was an extension case, it's not a new build. But the fundamental problem with the nuclear plants in this country, and that is public in the decision, is that they are not of a technology that is very modular. Basically, because of design choices of the past, they are very limited to, you can look at the decision, only about 20 cycles max per year. And therefore, you enter into a completely different discussion if you know from the very beginning that you only will be able, only in extreme circumstances, to modulate. How much focus do you put on designing the CFD just for these 20 cycles per year? And where do you put the trade-off? And I think that was, I can say from my experience, a lot of the discussion on the Belgium case, given the differences with, let's say, a new build, an EPR, which is designed to be modular.
Thank you very much, Fabien. It's quite interesting on the nature of the CFD, because we understand from the Commission that it's based mostly on academic publication, and so that's we see the shape of the contract evolving in life in a way. That's quite interesting. The second point that can be interesting to tackle. We spoke a little bit about reference price with Martin in the first roundtable, but to go a little bit deeper project by project, and maybe first it's a kind of philosophical question to say should nuclear be sold on the short-term market, for example the day-ahead market, the intraday, or the balancing market, and going back to Hinkley Point, we see that the reference price was a seasonal price, so more a forward market price. Do you think it's really an improvement in a way to to go for nuclear to be exposed on short-term markets and to modulate more? Does it has a cost in a way, this shift? Because the more you modulate, maybe the more it costs some money to the operator, and therefore it can increase the strike price in a way. So if you can just if you have some thoughts on that, I don't know. Maybe we can keep the same order. Marcin, do you have? Can you explain us a little bit more about the reference price? Do you think that it's a good idea for nuclear to be exposed to short-term prices?
Yeah, that's a big question. Maybe I would just start with saying the obvious, that nuclear does not operate in a vacuum. And we see from the clean energy package where the Commission shifted its attention, and you can read in the impact assessment for the new regulation and directive on the internal electricity market, that there is a clear shift towards shorter markets, and even more, the shorter the better. And there is a focus on the liquidity on the shorter market, and also back in times, it's also based on the development of intermittent renewable sources, which are supported because the priority of this triangle in the values of EU energy policy, definitely the priority within this triangle was given to climate policy. It was kind of a little bit different word in a sense. And then we see that there is a focus on the developing day-ahead markets and also intraday markets. That's why contracts for difference, which were back then designed for renewable sources, all of them, you can read in the literature, they're based either purely on the day-ahead market or with novelties, intraday day-ahead markets with a component of intraday markets. And that was obvious in the Dukovany 5 case, so the first case, where the reference price is based solely on the yearly average price on the day-ahead market. That was the choice. So the question is, I'm referring back to my intervention in the previous panel. The question is how do you tackle, from the theoretical perspective, the calculating of the reference price? If you use the standard is day-ahead market because that's what is known and what is also known for the states, but nuclear is different. So the question is whether we should reflect on adding another layer in the calculation of the reference price. And here comes forward markets. So in the Polish case, the European Commission accepted the inclusion of the forward markets, so selling electricity. So the reference price reflects the venues, but only on the organized markets, where the operator will sell electricity. If it sells on the forward market, therefore it will be market average price of the forward products, meaning all of the possible forward products traded on organized markets, meaning more or less power exchanges. So here's the caveat that PPAs are not included explicitly in the calculation of the reference price. I think it's not only more natural or reasonable from the technical perspective to trade electricity from nuclear power plants on the forward market. It also addresses one of the Fabian said market failures we currently witness in the EU electricity market design. So this is the possibility to make the market maker, so to steer the forward market, because if you incentivize nuclear power plants to sell on the forward market, then they will add liquidity to this market, and also it might help to mitigate a little bit this question of load following or the modulation, just because if you sell on the forward market and there's an obligation, contractual obligation to produce electricity, you can just fulfill this obligation and produce electricity, and if it's reasonable, then you can engage on the spot market. But I think this is one of the crucial components, and contrary to intermittent renewable, not all, but intermittent renewable sources, nuclear is well suited to develop forward markets, I think it needs to be used in this way. That would be a little bit of a pity if we just create one standard reference price and apply it to all technologies irrespective of their characteristics.
So maybe for the French project, with an additional question to go back to Laurent's introductory remarks, do you think it still makes sense to focus on a spot market, given the fact that in a few years or a few decades we will have only decarbonized mixed, where the marginal cost does not mean a lot regarding the cost of the system?
I think Fabien said that the experts haven't found something better than what is currently the spot market to allocate on short term the good capacity to answer the needs. So it is the best tool we have to operate just the electricity system. So no question on that. But on the other hand, as you said, nuclear allows us to also to bring forward products, and this is also very important because in France, for instance, the year 2026 is solved. And this is also the way the consumers is protected by the volatility of the spot prices. So it depends what you want to do. And the design of what we are doing now will make the future how we want it to be. Clearly, it was a question I set during my introduction. There is a big question. Yes, this system was invented, by the way, by Marcel Boitté and others a long time ago, but okay, it was really much adapted for the financing of capacity which were at marginal cost. We are switching to capacities which are all, capex oriented. So the question is, to which extent we set up a system which, is financing in an adequate way this capex, and then, having said that we rely on this spot market to ensure the stability of the electricity system, we need to bridge the gap. Of course, there is a capacity mechanism which brings some stable revenue for capacities, but the balance between both markets is maybe to be questioned, because at the end, if we all have in France, for instance, our capacity to replacing the old nuclear fleet with new nuclear fleet on CfD, if all the renewables are covered by CfDs, it doesn't make that so much sense to have this complete switch of the system. But on the other hand, it's a good question for experts to solve, because we are not all in the same situation. Have a look to Italy. We are on the majority relying on gas still, so it's not the same situation at all. But still, if the direction is decarbonization, we might have to change a bit the electricity design model, taking into account that if all capacities are covered by a CfD, it doesn't make that much sense. Yes.
And so, if I may, but really to make the bridge between Laurent and Fabien, because it's very interesting to also step back from the question on the reference price of the CfD to, okay, what is the system we are moving forward long term? As Laurent said, we have not yet found let's say the silver bullet, the actual solution. The hybrid market framework pushed forward by Fabien in his academic work, is definitely the I would say, if I may, the right framework for today. Maybe just as an anecdote, I was at MIT last week for a conference with Paul Josko. Actually, Paul Josko, so in the US, they have the same issue. Actually, Paul Josko introduced his remarks by actually quoting Fabien to say, okay, in France, they have this French economist called Fabien who wrote about hybrid markets, so that might be something we should read in the US. So it's just an anecdote. Don't blush, Fabien, but it's a true story to say. So economists and academics need to still work before designing the CfD on the whole system design to really reconcile this trade-off between de-risking ex ante and dispatching ex post. As you said, Laurent, ex post, we have not found yet a better instrument than the short-term price to dispatch, despite the merit order curve being more and more discontinuous, because we do not have those steps coming from thermal plants, which might be nice, smooth. Storage might smooth a bit But as you said, now the short-term dispatch price is bound to do bang from zero with renewables and nuclear variable cost towards a very high, whether it's value of lost load to the extreme, or very high thermal, decarbonized thermal variable cost. So we need to face this new reality for the dispatch. We definitely need to flesh our de-risking leg, because there's no way additional investment can be made facing this volatility between 0 and 100, 200 euro per megawatt hour, whether by the state or by any individual operator. So at the end of the day, it's really a question of risk sharing. So also the discussion started this morning was very interesting to say, okay, there's no magic. The risk is not going to disappear if the CfD helps the operator to engage into a project thanks to the de-risking value of the instrument. Basically, the risk is offloaded to the state, which acts as a counterpart, which will have to basically manage this risk. And this is where forward markets kicks in, because between the life cycle of a nuclear plant, 60 years typically, the CfD duration 40 years, and the hourly by hourly update, depending on the sun, the wind, and so on, you do have this medium-term, let's say, time period where we need to manage risk. We need to sell forward to some extent, to update depending of information, but not everything. So now back to our discussion about the reference price of the CfD. Indeed, we need to do better than HPC, if I may, by including spot prices, day ahead, because nuclear is, let's say, able and should modulate to some extent when there's this technological feasibility. It's an optimization under constraint, industrial constraint, grid stability constraint. You have what we call in our report internal limits and external limits to the modulation. But within this space of optimization, there's definitely modulation to be done. So the operator needs to be incentivized for this this modulation, so spot prices, and the whole array of short-term price signals. Because if we still believe in those short-term markets, that's a change, but we need to still complete them. So we need a basket of reference of prices. The day ahead is still somehow the cornerstone, the anchor for the rest, but we need to complement this basket with intraday, ancillary services, all those very real-time prices, and the forward markets to make sure that the CfD gives let's say the right incentives to still be active on the forward markets.
A couple of comments as well. So you have two questions that we have addressed. You have the question of, is it useful or not to include these forward references in the reference price? And the second question is more on the modulation. I have a comment on both. So on the forward question, I think fundamentally what we are discussing here is whether or not, by including the forwards, and in what proportion, you want to define a normative hedging strategy for your operator, if I can be a bit brutal. And it is the first time that the states and the Commission have a leeway to deal with that question of incentives for forward hedging. For a long time, we've said, okay, there is a problem in power markets. They are very short term. And we don't really have a tool. I mean, there's been an history of regulatory interventions with market-making obligations on some dominant players, which have not been very successful, let's face it, in stimulating this forward market liquidity. This is not very different as a fundamental debate. Do we believe that it is a good way to stimulate forward market liquidity? One part of me says yes. If you want to complete the market failure, to address the market failure and make the markets more complete, you have one tool, which is an indirect tool. You will provide incentives to your nuclear operator to address that market failure through the definition of a normative hedging strategy that includes not just the spot, but the forward. But as was mentioned by Laurence, this has many other implications, because once you define a normative approach, then not only your operator will follow it, but a lot of other things that depend on the liquidity in the market and on the risk profile of different market venues will be affected. So for instance, suppliers who buy in the market, if there is more liquidity forwards, that could have the virtuous effect to lead them themselves to then change a little bit their procurement strategy. And you could think that this is going to have a systemic effect, which is quite interesting.
Just a clarification to fully understand. When you talk about forward market, what kind of length are we talking about? Is it 1 year, 5 years, 10 years?
So here I think, Martin, you were talking about organized forward markets, and I think there is a separate debate whether you should also include, the PPAs or the OTC transactions that we discussed. But let's keep it simple and just tackle the question of forward and what is organized. So I think the fundamental question here is you may not have one single answer, because in some countries there may be, for instance, tariffs. In others there may not be tariffs, which depend on a formula for hedging, which therefore has connections with or without the presence of liquidity in different time horizons. So I just wanted to mention that this needs very careful thinking, but as an economist defending the completeness of market, I have to say there is some appeal to say we will define a normative hedging strategy that will help through virtuous cycle the market to complete itself. On the second point, which is to what extent do you want to subject the nuclear operator to incentives to modulate in the short term, which I understand is your point. The big question I have here as an economist is, what are the costs of cycling, to put it simply? And it's very difficult to objectify in the case of nuclear. In the case of a nuclear or of a renewable plant, you switch it off or on. You know to some extent what you have to do and what are the costs. In the case of a gas plant, you save the fuel. In the case of a nuclear plant, as an economist, you would approach the definition of opportunity cost as what are my short-term avoidable costs. And even there, it's not simple, because you could say I save the fuel, the nuclear fuel, but that's not completely clear, because you have a window for the fuel cycle, and if you save it through one modulation, it means it gives you option value later on to use it differently. So I'm not sure. There are big savings there, and certainly it's not easy to compute. Secondly, do you save in terms of people you employ in the short term? No, because you still have your safety issue. I mean, I'm ignorant, but I can at least understand that, I think. And third thing, which makes it even more complex, when you do cycles, I would assume that you have an impact on the lifetime of some components because you have some materials fatigue. How do you factor that in? Your opportunity cost of cycling is not easy. And I can tell you, for instance, in the Belgium decision, I spent a lot of time with some economists from ENGIE and from the Belgian government trying to objectify this opportunity cost of cycling, because in the Belgium case, as I said, they are enormous for safety reasons. And it was very challenging to objectify. And therefore, I think I asked the question, well, if it's difficult to objectify, will the market reveal it? Meaning then the answer is, you define an incentive mechanism, and those who know, meaning EDF, will reveal through their bids and decisions what is the actual cost. That is probably the best way to do it. And in that way, I have to defend at least the theoretical point of defining an incentive framework that makes sense, because only those who control and can monitor these costs will be able to take the right decisions. So you need an incentive framework that reveals that.
Thank you very much. Maybe to make the link with the next question, we understand from the Polish decision, the way the reference price has been set, and it's logical from a chronological perspective. The operator will first address PPA's market, then forward market, and then spot market in a way. So it means that if all the production has been sold on PPA market or forward market, there won't be electricity sold on the spot market, or because we have the feeling that there is a kind of priority order: first long term, then medium term, then short term. Is it the right way to understand the construction of the reference price, or not?
Not entirely. That was the right one, because we've got what was notified to the European Commission, and then the final CfD design, including electricity market operations. Since PPAs are not including in the reference price, selling PPAs comes always with a risk for the future operator of the nuclear power plant. Hence, there is a possibility to sell PPAs, so long-term products. By long-term, we mean the market will define what it means, because there will be like a market sounding before an auction. So PPAs will be sold only via the auctions, no possibility to sell over the counter, so in bilaterally negotiated agreements. And in order to prepare to design the best auctions, also to steer the competition in the auctions, there will be a market sounding of the interested parties beforehand, asking for the volume, the duration, and based on the results of the market sounding, the operator might decide to conduct an auction and sell PPAs. The auctions will be supervised by the National Regulatory Authority, and the price, there will be a minimum price, but the price will be set, there are economists here, so by the market, but I don't, without calculating the market price ex ante, but just through the competition on the market. Of course, there's a risk, as I said, for the operator itself, because it's not included in the settlement formula. That's why it comes with a risk. And that's exactly the risk you haven't mentioned previously, that if it's above the strike price, that would be additional revenue, but if it's below the reference price, not the reference price, then well, there's a foregone profit from the nuclear power plant's perspective. But that's for the PPAs and the design of the PPA auctions. But then, even if we assume that Polish nuclear power plant sells the whole electricity either via PPAs or the combination of PPAs and the forward market, there still remains an incentive to provide liquidity or to sell electricity on the spot market. That's where the dispatch is decided, because it's called spot price arbitrage mechanism, which says that even if there are contracts which were previously concluded, either PPAs on the forward markets, still nuclear power plant can purchase the electricity on the spot market, and instead of producing, then just fulfill those obligations through just purchasing electricity. On top of that, and also to address this potential liquidity of withholding the capacity, there's an obligation to offer all electricity which was not previously sold, so either through PPAs or the forward markets. So there are elements either through incentives or through the obligations to make sure that there are proper market behaviors in place for the nuclear power plant operator.
Thank you very much. For France, maybe an additional element that we can find in the decision is that when France describes the way or the different products that can be sold by the plant, they make reference to at cost at risk contract. That I guess is referring to a type of contract like CAPEN. It's an interesting element that is different from the other decision. Maybe it's specific to France or maybe not, but we can have industrials who are willing to participate to financing a part of the investment cost at the beginning and could sign contract by that, but we don't really see how it can fit with auctions, for example, or things like that. So do you think there is a risk that we will end up with a decision that prohibits those kind of contracts, even if they are very much, there is a real demand by industrials for those contracts?
A very well question, but I will try to keep it concise. Yes, of course, we are working together with the Commission to try to implement anyway some part of long-term contracts, PPA and so on. I mean, this is part of the discussion for this step of negotiating our state aid model for the first 6 reactors. And of course, we are all working to comply with the market rules which have been designed a long time ago and revised some years ago. But we also need to recognize that all these electricity market design have been implemented in the year 2000, 2010, where the long term was a concept. We were all living, benefiting from amortized capacities, long-term amortized capacities. We were switching to renewables, which are much more adapted to short-term signals, and we built all the markets that way. And now we are trying to correct and to implement and to comply to. But we need to recognize we will need to make further steps, because as Fabien said, PPA, or you spoke about CAPN, so risk-sharing contracts, whatever, answers not only to the current market rules, it also are designed to answer to industry needs, to access to capitals. In the 80s, what we need to finance our nuclear fleet was also to get cross-border contract so that we got access to foreign capital to support the financing of the nuclear fleet. Why? Because it was not that easy also in the 80s to get so much capital to build 5-year reactors to be connected in 1 year. I mean, can you imagine? It was really a large capital to get access to. And then it was also benefiting to our neighbors. So we had all other targets in these models, which was to build something which is according to the rules, but also not only to have a market today, we also need to recognize we also want to implement other objectives. And this is for us a big point to be underlined. We are now financing the 6 reactors, complying with the current rules and so on. But we also need to think broader for the next one to come, because we won't have so much public money to implement in these reactors. So we need to enlarge, to unlock all the financial mechanism. First, the European one, we are working through the Nuclear Alliance to get access to EIB credit and such kind of things. Of course, you know all our positions in that regard. But also to work on these cross-border PPA, which are absolutely not fitting the current market rules. Why? Because they were designed with cross-border tender, which are on a yearly basis on interconnections. At the time, again, where long-time contract was a concept. But now we need to go back to, and it's also a way to go further in the integration of European markets. I mean, that Italian industry, I mean, they are confronted to high prices and volatility. That what are their choices? Either to build long lines to the south of Italy to get access to renewables, or maybe to get some additional lines to France and then to take part to the French nuclear fleet so that they can benefit from this nuclear fleet. This we did in the past. Today, it's not really adapted to the current design market. We need to think together to the Commission and with our neighbors how the French fleets, for instance, can benefit to neighbors. And then we will build additional capacities we don't need right now, but we will need further when we will disconnect the old fleet, because it will become old one day. We try to extend the lifetime one day or the other. We need to disconnect that from the grid. And then we can have a regional energy policy which optimize on a regional basis, not only on national basis, optimize the investment cross-border so that we get more capacities in France than Italy is investing in nuclear for later. And then we can, have optimization at a regional level and not at national level. I'm pretty convinced this is really the future of Europe, to try not only to have a look to the national energy policy, but to extend our views. But for this, we need experts to work on the market designs to get adapted so that we not only work on the current state aid model according to the current rules, but we use this experience to think, to design the next rules so that we get a larger investment on nuclear European-wide. This is important for Europe. This is also important for the diversification of our electricity mix. The market won't decide for us. I mean, clearly, the market signals are not giving signals how much we want to diversify our mix. This is for us to decide and then to adapt the design rules for that.
Very interesting points, both on state aid and on the new model. Let me share a couple of thoughts on that. On your question, the at risk, at cost approach, I think this is an interesting question to say if we think a bit outside the box. What we have seen in the past, we have a precedent in Europe, which is the old Kyoto Finnish reactor, which was financed by a cooperative of end users, TVO in Finland. A lot of them are long-term focused, paper manufacturers, long-term metals manufacturers. So it is part of their DNA to think long-term in terms of affordable electricity supply. Long story short, the fundamental point in this cooperative agreement is that they agreed to put an upfront payment in exchange for having access, because they financed the plant or contributed to financing the plant, in exchange for having access to lower cost electricity. The fundamental question in such an agreement is that it makes it harder from a state aid perspective to investigate. Why? Because a lot of the European framework for state aid says you can deal with investment aid, but operational aid, meaning OPEX aid, is not something you should do. So a lot of the challenge is usually to repackage operational aid into an investment aid to make it then compatible, long story short. Now, I would hope that given that a number of things are moving on the state aid front more broadly, that with CSAF there is a little bit of a door opener, not a wide one, but a little bit of a door opener to discussing under some conditions operating aid for some industries in a targeted way. We can, in return, use that in the nuclear cases to explore other models than just the pure investment aid CFD models that we are looking at. I'm just being a bit provocative here, but why not? Let me look at the US. You have some big data companies who have announced that they will invest themselves in nuclear. What if tomorrow we have in Europe a new state aid case brought not by a member state, but by a member state together with a large industrial who says, I want to invest in nuclear directly in exchange for an at-risk, at-cost production agreement. That would, I think, lead to revisit some of the points I just mentioned in terms of the structuring of the aid, and it's a very interesting question to ask. Then on your second point, Laurent, on how to include the European perspective in all of that, I am a firm believer that this is necessary because a lot of these nuclear projects at the moment are dealt with purely on a national state aid perspective, but will have benefits which extend beyond national frontiers. And by the way, this is where nuclear meets other projects, large projects, which require state aid, such as renewables. For instance, the most directly comparable, I think, for renewables is offshore wind, because it's a large industrial project, usually very expensive, long lead times, which depends on the state commitment. And you see the same issues arising there. You see the same issues around how do I make sure that if I build as a state and subsidize one project, which is going to benefit my neighbors, how do we make sure that we have a framework for cost and benefit sharing EU-wide? So I would actually suggest that Laurent's point is an excellent one, which we need to approach not just from a nuclear perspective, but from a mix, sharing and benefits perspective, connecting it with the fact that we make different choices across Europe in terms of mix. That's to be respected. That is a subsidiarity principle. But there are benefits in the complementarity of these mixes. And that is something that is not recognized at the moment in the market model and can be internalized. Of course, it does require some methodologies for cost-benefit sharing. But again, this is not completely new. Methodologies for cost-benefit sharing, we have the beginning of that in the ENSOE methodologies. And we've been working as well as others on cost-benefit sharing for cross-border infrastructures in the context of offshore wind. Why not extend that to nuclear projects and have a common approach?
Charles, do you want to?
No, I think it's a very nice avenue for research and policy cooperation at the European level. So really to stop trying to uniformize our electricity mixes, but to really make explicit that we are different, we are heterogeneous, and you do have a comparative advantage to have wind in Germany, sun in Spain, nuclear in France. And for that, sometimes the short answer is a bit is falling short to say, okay, short-term markets, energy-only approach will sort it out. We will see all those co-benefits through spot pricing. This is not true because, as Laurent said, now we are migrating towards a system where more and more of the financial transfers and the risk sharing is going through this kind of long-term contractual arrangements. So we need to make them consistent. So in my understanding, somehow you have the defensive agenda, which is to make sure that in our different decisions with DG Comp, you do not have distortions, meaning that our own CFD is not going to prevent, PPAs, the contractual risk sharing, ex post, and because we will have to adjust to make sure that it's not just the independent-based output volume. It is also the reference price, where basically the weight needs to be decoupled from the actual strategy of the operator. So this is a technical, let's say, discussion we are entering now. But the objective is to make sure that we do not prevent additional risk sharing, such as the PPA, CAPEN, and so on. That's the defensive agenda somehow. And then the offensive agenda is to complete CfDs with a more cross-border approach, exactly as you two just laid out.
Thank you very much. Maybe the last question in 1 or 2 minutes each. The Commission raises the point of cross-border PPA, CfD. We tackle the issue a little bit, but do you see this coming? Because it's more like une incantation from the Commission that seems to be not really realistic in the short term, even if we understand that because of positive externalities of all these projects, if we do not have a financial solidarity, for example, like we had for the Common Agricultural Program or things like that, maybe it will raise this tension between member states, between those who will pay and those who will benefit from those projects. So do you see this cross-border CfD coming, or is it? Do you think that it will only happen if the legislation is more prescriptive in a way?
I see lots of political hurdles for that. Maybe it goes without saying, but I think that not only the regulation, but perhaps the political reality might steer towards cross-border CfDs, because we've already witnessed the tensions between Sweden and Germany, and also Sweden right now advocating for baseload nuclear power plants. So I think that perhaps those tensions might turn into regulatory actions. But for the incentives for the states, I think it merits a discussion, and this is a valuable idea. But for now, we don't see it in practice when the member states decide right now to build new nuclear power plants. It's not the first choice. They do it only through the lenses of national policies and addressing national problems. But I think that in due time it will merit further discussions, but it will require certain political will for sure.
On the French side?
No, again, I think the question is coming, and it's already a good result. We need to set it on the table. I mean, we have shores not all the countries, the member states have chosen to have offshore wind. We have nuclear sites. This is the result of the past, and you know how much it is difficult to embark to a nuclear program and on greenfield, to build everything from scratch. So we don't have the same opportunities for building new additional capacities for offshore, for nuclear, and if we want to diversify the mix at the level of the European level, we need to be realistic. We need to take all possible opportunities which are on the table and then facilitate the financing of the project where there are. And then through this, we might have a chance to succeed in our transition strategy, taking the opportunities right now, then building on future ones, and then making the full European program consistent. If we don't embark to this through these cross-border CfDs, PPAs, all possible mechanisms, which might request some changes in the design, but if we don't set up the challenges we are facing to, we will miss an opportunity for investment, we will miss optimization of this investment, and then I fear we won't succeed in our transition strategy to 2050 and beyond, because actually the target 2050 is one target, but have a look to the electricity system 2060, 2070, when all existing nuclear reactors will be shut down. I mean, this is a challenge for Europe to at least maintain the percentage of diversification we have today. Just doing that is a major challenge if you have a look to 2060, 2070. We have opportunities in different countries for offshore, for nuclear. We really need to set up a scheme, market rules, which allow countries to cooperate on regional basis and then to make private investment happening according to these rules.
And maybe a technical thought, to build upon what you just said, is that what misses, it seems, very technically and as I would say an academic, are state contingent transfers between member states. What I mean by that is that, capex cost sharing, we have the experience of interconnections. So you have some EU cases and legal experience, but for now, it's my understanding that basically you share the cost, and then you see on the market how basically the revenues will be shared ex post, and then you just observe. Okay, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, because basically the scenario that has been played in reality compared to what you were expecting ex ante is different. What you need to basically to fill the gap, is not just to create a new market, maybe decentralized, because that might be a bit too, theoretical to say, okay, let's just create forward markets with liquidity up to 20 years. That definitely helps. But at some point, there will be some discussion between governments in a very centralized way, I would say, but in a very cooperative and European way to basically design, state contingent transfers between member states. So you were referring to basically France and Italy. So it's a very high level of discussion between the French government and the Italian government to say, okay, let's share the cost of a given interconnection, but maybe a pool of assets, and then ex post. And let's agree ex ante for export transfers, but between member states. And so, but it's complicated. It has been to design very, let's say, nicely to be, let's say, complement with markets.
Yeah, just to be brief, and I think that's a fascinating discussion we should definitely continue. On this, let's also start, I would say, simple. So yes, state contingent transfers, I'm with you down the road, but first there is also the question of how you allocate EU money, right? And I think there is a lot that can be done to support and channel EU money to those projects that have these externalities, that have these benefits. So making sure that we have a way to agree on how to define these benefits and externalities in terms of mix would be a stepping stone for me, because before you even talk about transferring money from states, if you have an objective set of metrics, then you can start simply using common funds at EU level and channel them to those projects which have, these benefits. And that is easier than having, redistributive conditional mechanisms, which I agree would be nice to have. And perhaps the missing part in all of that is also that we are discussing also network and generation. Let's not forget that the mix is essentially generation, but the mix is contingent on being able to consume and transfer wherever it's needed. And I feel we are back to the discussion we had on the grid package, right, to some extent. How can we have an integrated perspective on the grid side that includes these externalities also on the mix side? And I think it's fair to say the recent debate on the grid package was disappointing in that respect.
Maybe just to add on a positive note that we might be having a cross-border CfD potentially, because there's one nuclear power plant in the EU, in Krszko, where the output is separated between two member states. So perhaps, and there will be a referendum on this one, so we might have this one as a proxy for any new considerations.
Thank you very much. Maybe it's time for a few questions from the audience. Do we have a question? No? Yes? Mathieu?
Yeah, so thank you very much for your presentation. One question on my side regarding the reference market price, and especially, do you think it's likely that everything will be sold on forward markets? Is it something that you think is possible? And also, in the Polish case, I'm not sure to understand what are the obligations or the incentives to sell part of the production on short-term markets, because you mentioned that there is some kind of incentive. I'm not sure to understand how it works in practically. Thank you very much.
That's also the first part is for me. Okay, so I will tackle and then you'll complement. So in terms of whether it's feasible to sell everything on the wholesale on the forward market, I think it all depends on the member states. One of the peculiarities of the Polish forward markets is that those are physical contracts. So contracts with the obligation to deliver electricity, and previously with a mix, maybe not dominated by coal power plants and natural gas power plants, that was the case. So that was typically what dispatchable sources did, just sell everything on the forward market. Of course, the mix changes, and right now we also see the decrease in the liquidity on the forward market. But according to our estimates, it is feasible. It will be feasible, but well, we will see in 10 years' time in this respect. So this is for the purpose. For the second, so there are more incentives to sell on the forward market, but still the day-ahead market will be included in the reference price. So if the operator decides to sell everything on the day-ahead market, then the day-ahead will make a reference price. That's why it will be equally incentivized to sell also on the day-ahead market, also given the technical constraints. So it's up to the operator to decide. It has full discretion to sell for different products on the organized markets, as long as they are conceived as an organized market.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question also. This is where basically the CFD design does interact with, market microstructure, and to what extent the market is actually open or just theoretical. So this is where the Commission is somehow well grounded to challenge us on our impact on the liquidity of those forward markets. At the end of the day, someone will have to bear the basis risk between, especially as information gets revealed. So whether it is the operator, the CFD counterpart, or anyone, you can trade electricity forward, and somehow you take a bet to some extent. You do hedge, but you also take a bet on the fact that the situation might materialize on the spot in a different way. All that to say that the idea is to make sure that the risk management and is not distorted by the CfD. CfD is really a very ex-ante instrument to trigger the investment today for 40 years, 60 years then of operation. And then you have really the risk management, which is not quarter hour by quarter hour, but 1 year before, 1 quarter before. And then it's totally, I mean, we are all part of this agenda of creating more liquidity and opting more market signals on those ones. So we just need to make sure that the risk management strategy will happen, whether it is through the operator or through the CfD counterpart.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question, or can we leave it there for today? Well, thank you very much to all of you for this great